First of all, thanks for being on the show.
The most important single factor in determining your likelihood of chronic disease was not smoking, not alcohol abuse, not sedentary behavior, lack of exercise.
Dr. David Harper is an expert in cancer research and the author of the Bio Diet. He believes that reducing sugar and adopting a ketogenic lifestyle will have a huge impact in reducing your risk of cancer.
Why do you think so many people are getting sick today? What do you think the biggest cause is for disease?
We don't really spend enough time and effort on preventative medicine. What we do is wait till things break.
What is the meaning of success to you?
So you could reduce your likelihood of contracting chronic disease, so cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, by about 70%, 70.
If you could put the most simple change, one thing that to have the biggest impact on their health, what would that be? Guys, this is a brand new podcast, and the goal is to interview the most iconic figures in sport and health from around the world. But I need to ask you guys a big favor to please like and subscribe, because it would make a huge difference to the size of this podcast, and ultimately, the bigger the podcast gets, the bigger the guests. Enjoy this episode. First of all, thanks for being on the show. As I said, I'm really excited to chat to you today. I have had this sort of second side of me, I guess, away from the professional sport, where I've been really interested in the topic of health and longevity, and basically anything that can help us as humans to enjoy life better and perform better. And and you're the first doctor that I've had on the show. So thanks for being on.
Oh, my pleasure. I qualify that. PhD, so doctor by title, but not a physician. I'm a researcher. But I do teach, pre-medical school, medical school sort of courses, anatomy, physiology, pathology, contemporary health, and of course, nutrition as well.
So you are obviously a big proponent of the ketogenic diet. You're also an author with having written the Bio Diet. I thought I'd start with why do you think so many people are getting sick today? What do you think the biggest cause is for disease?
Well, I'll back up just a bit. You're introducing me yourself to me just before we started recording, and you're mentioning you're world-class mountain biker. I was actually born in North Vancouver, living in Vancouver now, which is a very famous mountain biking area. Lots of great trails here, and a couple of world-class and Olympic champion mountain bikers from our neighborhood. So it's something I'm kind of familiar with, and Whistler, BC is also a place where people come in the off-ski season to do mountain biking. So interested in that. So sorry, to get back to your question again, thanks for having me on the show. If I had to talk about my values, my purpose in life, it would be to help other people have happier, healthier lives with what I've learned through my education and my personal experience, and through actually a couple of hundred podcasts like this with people like you. So thank you very much for providing me the opportunity, and thank you for doing a service to everyone to allow people like me to talk about health. And one of the reasons I think it's really important is that there's so much gunk out there on the internet, and so many people are trying to sell you things. So I'm not trying to sell you any other than my book, which is sitting behind me here, Bio Diet, which is about ketogenic diets. But I would say if you want to look at the burden of disease, which I think is your question, the global burden of disease, in 2017, the journal The Lancet published a very comprehensive global study on what was causing chronic disease in terms of lifestyle factors. So not genetic factors or accidents or infections, but in terms of lifestyle factors. Although I guess infections could play a part in that because of if you're in good health, you're more resistant to them. But what they found was by far the most important single factor in determining your likelihood of chronic disease was not smoking, not alcohol abuse, not sedentary behavior, lack of exercise. It was nutrition, and it was the food you eat, and that, it turns out, was more important than all of the rest of those other factors put together. So
Crazy.
There's no question in my mind, also from my own personal experience and from my research experience, that what's on the end of your fork is probably the most important health decision you make on a daily basis. And so that's where I decided, like you, I've had a sort of switch of careers. I started my career as a physiologist in something called mathematical biofluid dynamics, which is quite a different field. And I've been in the field of nutrition for about 20 odd years now, doing research and teaching and the like. And I think one of the things that's good about what both you and I have done is you come with a fresh idea, a fresh approach when you come into a new space. So I'm also interested in what you've learned through your journey. I've only read the thumbnail sketch, but I know you had some injuries. You've had some health challenges, some of which I share. In my case, panic attacks. That's something that I had to deal with as a younger man. And the good news is that we have ways of addressing all of those health issues, but really we have to start with what we're eating, because that's what gives us fuel and all the raw materials to rebuild us. And our life is really a constant process of rebuilding. And if you do it right, you rebuild in a healthy way. And if you do it wrong, things start to break down.
Yeah, well, for me, as you mentioned, with my career and why I actually wanted to do this was because I'd had these health issues. And I think a lot of people are cruising through life blissfully unaware, of what they are doing to themselves, and thinking that they are doing the right things and being healthy, from what they read in the media or they see on TV. And I was one of those people, and I had thought for years that I was healthy and doing everything right, and obviously I was doing a lot of sport and stuff, and I realized, quite abruptly that I might not have been doing the right things, and so it led me into this other side, and so even though I've been still competing over the last since my injuries and things, and I had a melanoma diagnosis in 2019, and that's kind of what I had. 2 broken hips back to back, so 2 years in a row, and which led to a complete hip replacement on the one side, and a couple of years of recovery, and then I had a melanoma diagnosis right after. So obviously there was a lot of trauma there, and that led to then mental health issues and panic attacks and insomnia and chronic anxiety. And it was quite crazy because I realized how fragile, the human body is. And I had always sort of laughed it off in a way, when I was younger. I was like, oh, come on, what are people talking about? They're having mental issues or they're depressed. I was like, oh, just get over it. But I realized then that, the body sometimes has its own mechanism, and there's nothing you can do about it. And the symptoms you feel are very real. And it sort of shocked me also in terms of my own self-confidence, because I had thought that because I thought I was eating healthily and doing the right things, that this wouldn't happen to me. And as it turns out, it sort of broke my sense of reality, and that led me into this path of also pretty much every day researching what could be better in terms of diet, sleep, anything, biohacking, red light therapy, cold exposure, fasting, meditation, you name it. I've read about it. And that's why I'm partly so excited to start to be actually able to speak to the professionals like yourself and really dig deeper into this and hopefully help other people, as many people as possible, to hear what the truth is and what they can do to actually help themselves. Because I think I don't trust the medical system as a generalization. I think orthopedic, and surgeries for accidents, that's fantastic. But I think a lot of the way that people are treated for disease is not always necessarily the best. And I think there's always a lot of money behind it, and that's on the agenda, and the big pharma wants to make money. So it's not always about caring about people, which is a shame. But it's it's the world today it needs help.
No, I hear everything you say. Had many of those same experiences. I think one of the great things is that you're curious. You're not stopping. You're not just accepting the conventional wisdom about anything. You're going and learning on your own. I believe in lifetime learning as an educator as well. So I think that's all really important. And when you talk about healthcare systems in the West, I don't call them healthcare systems. I call them disease management systems. We don't really spend enough time and effort on preventative medicine. What we do is wait till things break, and then we have these increasingly, sexy and expensive ways of fixing things and keeping people alive. And much of that effort is in response to the fact that people have adopted poor lifestyle habits that eventually lead to chronic disease, that eventually lead them to illness, especially, in the latter third of life. And that's, if it ends up with hospitalization and so on, that's the most expensive way to deal with a health issue. So we know it's far better to prevent something than to address it. So, but I was a visiting scientist at the BC Cancer Research Center here in British Columbia, the Terry Fox Lab. People would ask me, because of that experience in cancer research, they said, well, what's the best way to treat cancer? And I said, well, the best way to treat it is don't get it in the first place. But I kind of say that don't wait until you have it. But even that, Stefan, I'm gonna give you a pop question. If you think about our lives, you've had melanoma. It is the second leading cause of morbidity and mortality after cardiovascular diseases. But how many if you live an average lifespan of, say, 80 odd years, what's the likelihood, or how many times do you think an average person would develop potentially metastatic cancer in those 80 or so years? Just give me a number. I'm putting you on the spot completely. But
Wow. Geez. You mean where it actually metastasizes into real cancer, or you meaning
the cells
where it's cell division and I mean, so I had heard something that you have cell division. Don't you have cell division sort of every day, or sort of on an ongoing basis, and your immune system
Yeah,
keeps
of course.
it at bay?
Cells are dividing every day. I mean, some cells don't, like nerve cells and muscle cells, but the rest of them do. Epithelial and connective tissues. So the answer is you develop cancer cells about 2 or 3 times every day.
Crazy. Yeah.
They don't become cancers that are diagnosed and treated because we have this amazing immune system that detects them and realizes that they are our own cells that have gone rogue, and then destroys them through a number of different methods. So much of preventing that is related to maintaining a healthy lifestyle that maximizes or optimizes your immune system. I shouldn't say maximizes, optimizes. I don't like it when I see people talking about immune boosting, because you don't want to boost your immune system too far, because there's all kinds of inflammatory diseases like arthritis and MS and so on that are a result of overactive immune systems, maybe even diabetes type 1. But we want to have an optimized immune system that's able to identify and destroy things. Of course, as we get older, everything sort of slows down, and the vigilance of that immune system slows down as well, which is why we see more cancers appearing later in life, typically. But I think a lot of that can be avoided if we adopted better lifestyle changes. And they're not, you were a professional athlete. Obviously, professional athletes are physically very fit and strong. Depending on if you're a world-class athlete, you're probably overdoing it a bit, which is how you become world-class when you're competing at that level, is you have to push yourself beyond the normal limits of humanity, right? So I have a lot of students that are triathletes, and the first thing I tell them is, that's an obsessive compulsive disorder, right? Like normal people don't do that stuff. And even though you can do it, it doesn't mean your body is designed to do it every day for 10 years. So you have to keep things within reason. I think about, if my back of the envelope calculation is that if we look at the chronic diseases that provide most of that burden of mortality and morbidity, it's really cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and then all the rest are much less incidence and prevalence. And I think you can reduce your risk of that with some simple lifestyle changes. And I'll get to the most important one, nutrition, at the end. But making sure you get adequate sleep and rest. We talked about athletes that kind of overdo it. You need to get rest as well. We're learning more about that in the exercise science, how important rest is and recovery. You need to get regular exercise. You need to move. I call it, Stefan, my salmon theory. We have salmon here in the West Coast. At the end of their life, they keep swimming like crazy up these streams and they find the place where they're going to lay their eggs, and then they just die. So think of yourself like a salmon. As soon as you stop moving, you're going to die. You're sending signals to your body that, things are up now and we don't really need to continue. And we're just, in a biological sense, we're consuming resources that our children and our grandchildren could be using. So, but if you keep moving, and it doesn't have to be a lot, just take a walk after a meal and ride a bike once in a while. And they say 150 minutes a week. That seems to be a pretty well confirmed number, which isn't that's not a whole, that's only 2.5 hours during the whole week. So I probably exercise like you, probably an hour to an hour and a half every day, different forms of exercise. Half an hour, that would be like stretching and yoga type exercise. Yeah. I do some meditation as well. And then, so you have your sleep and rest, you have your exercise, and then it's food. Maybe before we get to that, we can talk about stress management a little bit too, because that helps the neurological system. But my back of the envelope calculation is that you could reduce your likelihood of contracting chronic disease, so cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, by about 70%, 70.
Wow.
If you adopted a healthier diet, and if you want to start there, we can look at what our policymakers / governments tell us is a healthy diet. And the first thing I would argue, which goes back to your very first question, is I think that's the problem right there, is what they've been telling us is a healthy diet. It is in fact not a healthy diet. And I think it's the root cause of much of the burden of chronic disease today.
It's it's so interesting that what you hear and read is just about opposite. The food pyramid is a big scam, and they should just flip it upside down. So, do you think that exercise or diet? You think diet is more important than exercise?
For what?
In terms of health and longevity.
Yeah, well, both, but you have to eat. Daniel Lieberman at Harvard wrote a really good book called Exercised. I don't know if you've read that, Stefan. It's a really good book because he's a researcher, and he sort of takes an anthropological approach to exercise. Most animals out there, I'm a biologist, by the way, so all of my perspective comes from my understanding of biology. So from a biological evolutionary sense, there are no other animals that exercise. Sometimes they play, but they only move around for purpose. They don't just run for the sake of running. It all has some purpose. Now, that it's a bit of an extreme viewpoint, but I do think moving is something, because of the technological advances we've had, that we no longer do. So in our evolutionary past, we would have to hunt and gather, and that would be a tremendous amount. Probably they're saying 20,000 steps a day, and a lot of running around and climbing things. And so we don't do that anymore. So we are designed to do that, and we should do that. So that's why we need to exercise. I agree. But there are people that do almost no exercise and manage to maintain their health. Part of that's genetic. But if you have a poor diet, all the exercise in the world isn't going to help you. So we say, you can't outrun your diet, and that is the fuel you put in your body. Now, so if you're asking me which is which in terms of weight management, and frankly, a lot of people that buy my book Bio Diet or that come to a ketogenic diet, it's because they've heard it's very good at weight loss, fat loss in particular. Very good for body composition and so on, which is the fat to lean mass. And I realize that. And in fact, if you look at, sort of combining all of the research, it's about an 80-20 rule. So your weight and your body fat is about 80% due to diet and about 20% due to exercise.
Wow. Okay.
So that's why we say you can't outrun a bad diet. And I have lots of friends that are, one friend in particular is a world-class triathlete, retired now, but he thought the opposite, that, you could do better. And now he's got some cardiovascular issues. He's got some diabetes starting because he was carbo loading for too long. And he's had 2 hip replacements, by the way. He just wore his body out, but he also, fueled himself with beer and spaghetti, which isn't really the best way to fuel yourself, it turns out.
Yeah, from my experience, and I mean, being a professional athlete, the last, over the last decade, I really don't think that professional sport is particularly healthy. I don't know what your view is on that, but I think exercise for sure is good. But I also have some friends that are triathletes and things, and the amount of wear and tear in the body that and stress on the body that you're putting on. I don't know if the bodies were designed to do that. Especially,
it's a good point, because professional athletes, they're not competing to be healthy. They're competing to win. And so anytime you win or make any decision in life, there's consequences. So if you're going to raise your physical ability to the level of a professional athlete, you're going to have to compromise on other things. And some of that, typical example would be NFL football linemen who are now regularly mid 300 pounds. That's not healthy. Even for really big people, it's just not healthy. And so their average lifespan is in the 50s. It's like 25 odd years shorter. So, but they get paid $6 or $8 million a year to, stop other guys from getting to the quarterback. So that's the compromise they're making. They're excellent, amazing athletes at what they do. We could throw sumo wrestlers in there too, but it doesn't mean that that's healthy just because they're an athlete. They're competing to win, and that's different than trying to make lifestyle changes to be as healthy as you can be. To optimize your health is the term I like to use.
I see your book there behind you. I mean, you've advocated for the ketogenic diet, and I mean, as a lot of other people have as well, which received a lot of pushback, especially initially, like Professor Tim Noakes, for example, in South Africa. I remember when the Debunking diet came out many years ago. But how was it? How has it been in the industry, and what sort of challenges have you faced? Pushing this diet, and obviously, which is high fat, and going against a lot of what the medical industry had been telling everyone for the last few decades.
It's get back to the salmon. I feel like I'm swimming upstream sometimes. I haven't had. I mean, my hat's off to Dr. Noakes, who I know, through meeting him at a few conferences. He and a few others have been dragged through the muck and sued. And it's a very long and elaborate case where he was charged criminally for basically telling a person to eat a healthy diet, which is kind of a criminal act in and of itself. But there we go. So I came into this like we do when we change careers, with a whole lot of energy and excitement. And I said, wow, I've just discovered this amazing thing. And it actually started with that same question you just asked me. I was on a radio show with another fellow who is a professor emeritus of medicine at UBC, the University of British Columbia here. And we were asked that question. I was the kinesiology professor. That's my title. And asked, what's better for weight loss? Is it exercise or is it diet? And so I started off on the, obesity, overweight, if you want to look at that, is a very complex, multifactorial condition that has psychosocial factors and hormonal factors and genetic factors. And he just sort of waited till I finished talking. And then he said, no, it's not. He said, it's much simpler than that. It's your body's natural response to excess carbohydrate in the diet. And I did this. on radio, they call that dead air. Same thing in podcasts. Because I was flabbergasted, because you got to remember, I've been teaching like physiology for more than 20 years. And what he said, when it was registered in my brain, completely made sense with, I've been to have a PhD, I've been to Cambridge, done postdocs, studied physiology, and I just never thought of it that way, which is to me, terrible on my part, because I'd also been teaching that policy-based standard American diet, we call it, that food pyramid, the high carb, low fat diet. I've been teaching that to students for 20 odd years, and I thought, oh my God, what if I've been wrong all this time? And so that took me down the rabbit hole. That same question took me down the rabbit hole, and I spent years trying to research where those guidelines came from. And the answer is not from science. And then I looked at the emerging field, I should say re-emerging field, because you mentioned Banting. Banting was in the late 1800s. Ketogenic diets had been used in the 1900s, early 1900s in particular, for children with epilepsy very successfully. So it's the re-emergence of a very low carbohydrate, what we now call a well-formulated ketogenic diet, as a way of treating and maybe preventing disease. So this was something that first thing I did was I said, okay, well, certainly saturated fats cause heart disease, right? Because that was the whole start of the first food recommendations. Was Ansel Keys in the United States, in America, and he had this so-called diet heart lipid or diet heart hypothesis that it was saturated fat and cholesterol in the diet that was causing heart disease. And that was a nice hypothesis, and he had some, mind you, kind of cherry-picked and doctored information to support his hypothesis. And he did actually test it himself, but never published the results because the results were what we call didn't support rejecting the hypothesis, accepting the null and rejecting the hypothesis, but he never published that. But that's what we're stuck with, Stefan. And we've been stuck with this for about 40 or 50 years. So I would argue since 1980, when those first dietary guidelines came out in the United States, and all the other countries in the West followed suit because, the Americans must have it right. And we all started recommending these very high carb, very low fat, very, very low fat saturated fat diets. It's been an experiment on people in the West, on hundreds of millions of people. And we have the results. And the results are that we have these absolutely epidemic increases in obesity and overweight, and the corresponding increases in diabetes and cancer and cardiovascular disease. And yes, there are other factors involved with that. But I think if you look at the root cause of chronic disease, you have to look all the way into the body's metabolism and the organelles within cells that are responsible for that, mitochondria in particular, but other organelles, obviously the nucleus and the like. But if we look at the mitochondria, which is an energy converter within the cell, you're really going to be about as healthy as your mitochondria are. And your mitochondria are like a high performance race car. If you feed them good fuel, high octane fuel, they're very happy. And if you feed them gunk, it's like putting, as kids, we used to joke about putting sugar in somebody's gas tank, right? Because it would gum up their engine. Well, you're kind of doing the same thing when you eat a lot of sugar and carbs. And all carbs, by the way, become sugars by the time they're digested and absorbed. Yeah. You're putting sugar in your gas tank and you're gumming everything up. And when you gum it up, it sparks inflammation. It causes insulin resistance. So the simple model I came up with, very simple model for chronic disease, which, by the way, I've presented all over the world to researchers and physicians and all kinds of conferences I've been invited to and the like, is that chronic disease has three major components to it from a causative aspect. So looking at the cause, we can talk about diabetes in a second as treating a symptom, but the root cause at that level is obesity, which is a disease, and it is not. There are no obese animals in the wild. The only obese animals are humans and our pets. So obesity is a disease. Insulin resistance, which is a little harder to detect and measure, but this is our body's response to excessive sugar in the blood, and then inflammation. And I'm talking about chronic inflammation, not the kind of inflammation you get due to an injury or infection, but chronic inflammation. And those three things together. And I encourage your listeners, try and Google them, just go into, now it's ChatGPT, right? Ask ChatGPT, what percent of diseases are related to any of those three things, and the number about 70% will come up. So my theory, which as I said is just a back of the envelope theory because it would be virtually impossible to prove, is that if we address chronic disease by addressing those three things, obesity, insulin resistance, and inflammation, then we will reduce the burden of chronic disease both as individuals and as societies, and our healthcare costs would drop dramatically.
And so it all comes down to sugar, pretty much. I mean, carbohydrates, any carbohydrates, whether it's potato, pasta, bread, or a candy bar, all turn into sugar. The question is, do we actually need sugar at all? And even if you look at it not just from a longevity standpoint, but from a performance standpoint, do you think there's actually any benefit to humans having any sugar, or do you think it's totally just terrible for us?
Yeah. Well, let's leave performance aside for a little bit, because again, if you're looking at people that are just competing to win and not competing to be in the best health they can be, that there's a bit of a trade-off there. But yeah, so all that starch, we call it, potatoes, pasta, rice, that starch are just a bunch of glucose molecules connected together. When they're all connected together, they don't have really any taste at all. But they do provide a source of glucose, and glucose is an important component. That is our blood sugar. So everything we eat that isn't is converted into glucose in the blood. Now, it's an interesting point, because you mentioned, do we need sugar? And so when we talk about sugar, I'm going to say carbohydrates. There are really three main classes of macronutrients, which are proteins, fats, lipids, fats, and carbohydrates. There are essential proteins for sure, because there's amino acids we can't synthesize, and there are essential fatty acids as well, the omega fatty acids we can't synthesize. So we do have to eat sources of those. There are no essential carbohydrates, and people are surprised by that, and they say, "What do you mean there's no essential carbohydrates?" You don't have to eat any carbohydrates at all, and you'll be totally healthy. And they, well, how can that be? Because how do we get our blood sugar? Well, we can produce it ourselves, like cats and dogs who don't eat a lot of pasta, rice.
Yeah.
Like almost all other animals, we can produce it ourselves through a process called gluconeogenesis, which literally means making new glucose. So you're making it from non-carbohydrate sources. You're making it primarily from amino acids and from the glycerol part of fatty acids. And so for the amount of glucose we need at any point in time, which, by the way, I'm going to put you on the spot again, Stefan. If I took all my blood out right now and I measured how much glucose was actually there, so my blood would be about 5 liters of blood in a typical average sized person like me. So if you measured it as you would measuring something when you're baking, how much sugar do you think would be in my blood at any point in time?
I think I might have heard this before, but I'm not 100% sure. But I don't think it's very much.
It's not.
Something, maybe like a teaspoon or something like that.
There you go. See, it's exactly. It's not even, but it's about a teaspoon. So a teaspoon in 5 liters of blood. So think of those big, 4-liter jugs or something like that. And put a half a teaspoon. That would be it. And as you can imagine, it's not a lot. So we have the ability to produce that glucose all the time through this process, which is done mostly in the liver, but also the kidneys and some other tissues to a lesser degree. And we do that happily. It's not a stress on the body. It's what we do at night. And so, like other animals, we can live happily without any carbohydrates. Now, people would say, well, what about fiber? Isn't that essential? Fiber can be a good thing. The fiber that's included in carbohydrates doesn't get digested in the same way that the other carbohydrates do, so it doesn't have the same effect on insulin resistance and inflammation. So, and you can get fiber in sources that don't include the starch. So eating things like, chia seeds and psyllium husk and so on will give you some, and other foods that you eat in small amounts on a ketogenic diet, like nuts are high in fiber. Some berries, like strawberries, tend to be high in fiber. But you don't actually need fiber, but if you eat it, it helps. But it's not essential. So that's the first thing, is you don't need any of that sugar in your body. The second thing is, we've been told for 40 years that that's what you should get the most of, is something that you don't actually need. So when you force something you don't need on a system, the system is going to have to deal with it. So if you put all this sugar in its various forms, this glucose, into our bodies, it gets broken down, it gets absorbed, and it's a massive amount of glucose that the body has to deal with. And first of all, it has to get it out of the blood, because if it stays in the blood, it creates havoc, which is the end results of diabetes, where you can't control your blood sugar. So, loss of limbs, blindness, what we call microangiopathy, and other issues. So your body is designed to get that sugar out of the blood. So it does, and it can only store a little bit in muscle cells. It can store more in the liver, but it tops out at about 500 grams. And then after that, all it can do is turn it into fat. And so, and by the way, when you eat a lot of sugar, you secrete a lot of insulin. When you secrete a lot of insulin, it biases your body to produce fat. And that's just a very simple physiological explanation that should be enough for most people. Eat a lot of sugar. Yeah. I know what insulin does. Yep. And insulin will cause you to put on fat. Yep. So reverse that. If you have a lot of fat on your body, you want to get rid of it. Well, you stop eating the carbohydrate. The insulin levels go down. You start metabolizing that fat through what we call beta oxidation. And you lose 3 pounds of fat for every 1 pound of muscle when you lose weight on a ketogenic diet. And that's been confirmed, for many, probably hundreds of studies over the last decade or so, that the weight loss is 3 pounds of fat to 1 pound of lean. By the way, on something like Ozempic, one thing they don't tell you about Ozempic, I'm sure it's popular in Germany as it is here in North America, the semaglutide, is that you lose 1 pound of muscle for every 1 pound of fat you lose.
Interesting. Okay.
And I'm starting to see it on some of the Hollywood, because Hollywood's all over this semaglutide stuff.
Yeah.
You look at some of the older men, like my age, they're trying to lose weight. Maybe they have a bit of a pot belly. Look at their legs. And you'll see these skinny little legs because they're losing too much muscle when they're losing. Like they might lose 20 or 30 pounds of fat, but it also means they're losing 20 or 30 pounds of muscle along with it. And that shows up mostly in their legs. So just a little hint for people out there. It feels good, but her legs look a little skinny right now. I don't know. And again, that's my theory. I call it the axis of illness. Is inflammation, obesity, and insulin resistance forms a triangle. And what's interesting about those is that if you have any one of those, it will make the other two worse. So that's what we call a positive feedback cycle, and positive feedback cycles always end in catastrophe. So what happens is, you get obese, you're going to be more insulin resistant. That's going to make you more inflamed. It doesn't matter what causes what or what served first. They all make each other worse. And so they'll just continue to make each other worse until it comes out as a chronic disease of one sort or another. So if the blood sugar is too high, we call it diabetes. If your blood vessels are getting inflamed and they're getting atherosclerotic plaques, we call that cardiovascular disease. If your brain is not functioning properly because it's getting all gummed up and inflamed, we call that Alzheimer's disease. And if your cells are not, if your immune system isn't vigilant enough to find and destroy cancer cells, you'll end up with tumors. So we call these different diseases, but it is kind of arbitrary. And if you look at the root cause of those, there is a common root cause at that metabolic level. So what we're seeing now, Stefan, is a big movement in experimental medicine, at least, and hopefully it'll end up in medicine, to look at metabolic disease and causing metabolic disease. How do we measure it and how we treat it? So we have a pretty good idea of what it is, but it's what causes it and how we treat it that's sort of up for debate. The medical system, as you've mentioned, will want to make money, so they'll come up with drugs, and some of those drugs work, and some of them, they'll all do something, but they all have side effects, and they may not be the healthiest thing. But my thought is, if you can just change your diet and have a better effect than any drug out there, why not give that a try first?
I mean, I'm 100% on board, and to me, it makes so much sense, the whole ketogenic movement. Although there have been questions raised, in things like, for example, performance. Can you perform at the same level on a ketogenic diet? And the other thing is, quite a few people have said that they have high cortisol on a ketogenic diet, and carbohydrates lower cortisol. And so, I mean, what's your take on that? And is that an issue? And how can you get around that if you are one of those people that does have higher cortisol levels on a keto diet?
And not just that, sometimes high triglyceride levels. What's common in women, about a third of women postmenopausal have high LDL cholesterol levels. There are changes because you're making metabolic changes. We're all different. I mean, ultimately, we have to personalize our diets for what works for us. And that's very important. And the only way to do that is to monitor what you're eating and see how you feel and how you perform. I'll address the performance one first, my colleague at Ohio State University, Dr. Jeff Bullock, has done a lot of work on this. He comes from a kinesiology background as well. I teamed up with him to work on our breast cancer study, so ketogenic diets as an adjunct therapy for breast cancer. But he's done a lot of work with college athletes and professional athletes, and a lot of very high-end professional athletes like the Tour de France cyclists. They have the financial capacity to hire the best, and also from the cycling world, I'll give you an example of a guy who was a pretty average but world class. Wasn't top of the field, and all of a sudden, he just changed physically. He changed, and his ability changed, and then he won the Tour de France 3 years in a row, and that was Chris Froome. And so he wouldn't tell anybody what he'd done, training, whatever. And then after a while, people sort of figured it out. He said, "Yeah, I adopted a ketogenic diet, and on a ketogenic diet, you lose body fat. So if you're thinking about, they'll spend tens of thousands to take a few grams off their bike, but if you take it off your body, it has the same effect. So if you become more lean through a well-formulated ketogenic diet, that's a benefit. But also, you metabolize oxygen better. So the ability to perform aerobically is really the ability to get oxygen to the muscle cells and for the muscle cells to use those to produce ATP and fuel the muscle contractions. And if you can do that with less oxygen, which you can do when you're adapted to beta oxidation as your primary source of energy production or energy conversion, then you have an advantage. And so, I don't know. I'm not consulting for any of the Tour de France athletes or anything like that. But my understanding is there are not just them, but there are a lot of other athletes out there that are professional athletes. Name the sport, and I'll give you some names who have adopted ketogenic diets. So that's one aspect of it, is increase in aerobic performance. Anaerobic, and I would put your, liken into anaerobic for sure. The probable thing is you can train on low carbohydrate, but you probably need to perform high. So things like basketball players, hockey players, probably mountain bikers would want to increase carbohydrate in their body just before they perform. And if it's a long event, during that performance as well. So, gel packs and so on are probably a good idea. And we have measured both their performance, but also, changes in insulin levels and so on. Because they're performing at such a high rate, the amount of glucose that they're intaking in whatever form doesn't really affect any of that metabolic stuff. It just gets burned right away, in other words. So it's not cause massive increases in insulin like, eating standard breakfast would. So that's one thing. Now, the other thing I can tell you, which is a bit of a trade secret from people who have been coaches in the Premier League in Britain and the like, there are some soccer teams who are very much interested in ketogenic diets. And the reason there is the aerobic capacity is one, but the other one they've discovered is injury recovery. Is athletes that are keto adapted have half the general time for injury recovery. And this is usually soft tissue recovery, so tendons and ligaments and the like. So much faster recovery times, probably because the inflammation is controlled on a ketogenic diet. It's one of the things that it does. And on the other hand, and I call it a vegan diet, but you can be vegan and be ketogenic. So it's a vegan diet that's high in carbohydrate. Athletes that have adopted that, and there's a list now. It's a growing list that's online. There's hundreds of them that, they snap their Achilles tendon and their life is over as an athlete. So it doesn't seem like taking all that fat out of your system is particularly good for your connective tissues when they're under great strain. And of course, on a ketogenic diet, which is a high-fat diet, you don't have to worry about that. So that's the performance aspect, or what I know of it.
Interesting. I've with the ketogenic diet, there's also been this now big movement into carnivore diets, plant-based diet. There's this, I think with social media, there's been this sort of explosion over the last few years of this is better, that's better. I've been looking at potentially doing a carnivore experiment for a month or so, just to see how I feel. I'm very open to experimentation and stuff. What do you think about the carnivore diet versus a ketogenic diet?
Well, a carnivore diet would be ketogenic. Unless,
It is, yeah, it is ketogenic, but obviously removing the vegetables and
yeah, I mean, I don't do that. I think you have to make sure that you're getting it. So when I say a well-formulated ketogenic diet, I mean, that's also a balanced diet. People don't understand the word balance from a nutritional perspective. That means you're getting all the nutrients you need. So as long as you're sure that you're getting all the nutrients you need, and most animal products are way higher concentrations of vitamins and minerals than any plant stuff. You say, oh, what's something good in vitamins? People say, oh, apples and oranges and stuff. You go, yeah, but beef would be way more vitamin C than an orange. Yeah. So if you're eating a piece of beef, you probably don't need that. And so, yes. So here's some short answers. We don't really know yet. We're now investigating people on ketogenic diets. And when I say we, I mean the community that's into nutrition science. Then I call it the new science of nutrition, because almost everybody that is now conducting scientific experiments is working on ketogenic diets. Nobody works on vegan diets or low-fat diets other than by comparison, because there's no identified benefit to it from a scientific perspective. But what's great about a ketogenic diet is we know at the cellular molecular level what's happening. In other words, we know the mechanisms, whereas a lot of these other diets are supported by what we call epidemiological evidence.
Yeah.
And, there's a joke about epidemiology, which is it's a statistical thing, which is, epidemiology is the plural of anecdote. So it's not what I would call science. Science means you need to, test a hypothesis and then see what happens, and then also explain the mechanism. And so if you look at the mechanism, I think it's pretty clear. So if you look at carnivore diets, from what we've seen on the limited studies we've done so far, we have had no adverse effects. And these have been ongoing for quite a while. So nobody on a carnivore diet, strict carnivore diet, has shown any adverse effects that you would say we have to stop this intervention from an ethical perspective because it's making these people sick. They're not getting heart disease. They're not putting on weight. They're not, in fact, all this stuff is reversing. They're actually finding themselves healthier. So I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that someone who adopts the carnivore diet is doing anything harmful. But I don't, on a one-on-one basis, I don't know what they're eating. So,
yeah,
if I can suggest someone to have on your show, there's an amazing young guy named Nick Norwitz. And Nick he did his PhD at Oxford. I won't hold that against him. I was at Cambridge, but he's American. He's at Harvard now. He's doing a PhD MD at Harvard.
Okay.
And very smart. And he does these N=1 experiments on himself all the time. He's very smart. He's very, he's got way more papers than I do, even at my age, on metabolism. And he's very much into promoting metabolic health. So one of the things he did was he said, well, I'm going to eat 2 dozen eggs every day for a month and see what happens. So he ate 720 eggs. That's all he needed. But he ate, it's an egg every hour. I wake every hour. So he's eating an egg every hour for a month. And he's totally fine. In fact, some things improved. There was no cholesterol issues or LDL issues, or whatever. And that makes 2 points. One is that you don't have to worry about saturated fats. In the absence of high glycemic index carbohydrates, saturated fats have no negative effect on your health. The second one is there's no relationship between red meats and colon cancer or digestive. That's just there was never that evidence was so weak based on a few papers from 30 years ago, and it stuck with us, and I don't know why. But red meat. I feel that's so. I know, but
it's so crazy because I know a couple of people that are doctors, and even they are now adopting vegan diets and trying to avoid meat because they think that meat is going to give them cancer. And from what I've seen, and obviously I'm not a doctor myself, but just from what I've seen and all the latest research, it just seems quite clear that that's not the case. But still, these medical professionals are under this belief.
So when you're asking me about, am I getting pushback? Nobody, and I've been doing this for a long time. Nobody's ever called me out and said, Dave, what you're saying isn't true. Here's why. Ever. Nobody's ever said that. But people will say that. Well, what about, the relationship between saturated fats and heart disease? Okay, what is that relationship? Well, saturated fats cause heart disease. And I said, cause heart disease? Okay. How do they do that? Because if you look at a saturated fat, it is the cleanest burning fuel you can put in your body. It's just carbon and hydrogen, no double bonds, no wacky stuff. It's completely benign in terms of a health risk. But yet we still believe that. And most physicians, most cardiologists still believe that. And the reason for that is that physicians, and you know, I have great respect for physicians. We can criticize the medical system, we can criticize pharma, but don't criticize the people in it. Most of them are in it for the right reason. They're trying to do the best job they can. But they don't get any training in nutrition in medical school. In the United States, the average is 2 to 3 hours during their medical program of 4 years for nutrition. And it's usually, what can you do in 2 to 3 hours? We'll do more in this conversation in a half an hour than they get in 2 or 3 hours. And all they do is they tell them there's 3 macronutrients, you got to get vitamins and minerals, and here's they call it the food plate in the United States, right? Or here's the food pyramid, and that's what you should teach your patients. And then, you know, if we want to talk about diabetes, they'll go, well, diabetes is related to obesity, so you need to reduce your body fat, and you should do that through a low-fat diet because eating fat makes you fat because it's energy dense. And even that, can we talk about that for a sec? The whole calorie?
Yeah, sure.
I just wrote an article about it because, so here's another thing that happens. So I'll be eating something. Oh, doesn't that have a lot of calories in it? I go, what do you mean? Well, it's, you know, you're eating something like, you know, avocado or, you know, butter, something like that. It's got a lot of calories in it. I go, yeah, it's a good thing. You need calories. And they go, yeah, that'll make you fat. And I go, well, why? Well, if you eat more calories than you burn, then you're going to get fat. And I go, well, there is some sense to that. But let me ask you, I'm putting you on the spot again, Stefan, so this is the third time today. What is a calorie? Like, what is...
That's actually... I mean, I would imagine it's a source of energy.
Right. It's a unit of heat. It's the amount of energy it takes to raise, you know, a millimeter of water by 1 degree Celsius. It's a heat. Mm-hmm. It's a measurement of energy. Okay. So when you gain weight, that's not energy, that's mass. So every nanogram of mass on your body went through your mouth. We don't add mass any other way than eating it. And, you know, the air we breathe it back out again. So the only way you can put on weight is by eating more and eating more mass. Now, but we do need energy, roughly 2,000 calories a day. So if you want to get the most energy, but eat the least amount of mass, then you want to eat the most energy dense food, which are fats, which are more than twice the energy density of proteins and carbohydrates. So by that very argument, you should say, well, you should be eating more fat and less of this other stuff if you want to lower the amount of mass you're putting into your system and still get the same amount of energy out of it. I mean, that's grade 8 science, but nobody thinks about it that way, yet it's so simple to understand. And we're so brainwashed into thinking, oh God, saturated fat causes heart disease, and oh God, things with lots of calories are bad for me. So we don't, that calories in, calorie out, the caloric sort of model is, I think I could argue, is pretty much debunked these days, and it just doesn't work because all calories are not, the foods that come with those calories are not treated the same way when they get in your body. So proteins are metabolized differently from fats, which are metabolized differently from carbohydrates. Mm-hmm. And the one you don't want to have a lot of in your system in your diet is carbohydrates because it will, you know, when you raise your blood sugar, the other thing that happens is you promote the production of these things called advanced glycated entities. So the glycated is from the words. And that is, going back to our analogy about putting sugar in the gas tank, those advanced glycated entities are the gum. They're the gum in the system. And they cling on to arterial walls, and they cause inflammation, and they gum up DNA, and they prevent proper gene expression. They do all kinds of gummy things through your system. I'm really trying to talk in simple terms here. But they cause inflammation. And so now we even call it inflammaging. Like, inflammation could be the key component to what we call aging. And one of the things that promotes inflammation is the production of advanced glycated entities, which are a result of overconsumption of carbohydrates and too much glucose in your system. So you turn your system against itself by creating this chronic inflammation, and by continuing to eat a high carb diet, you just maintain that high level of inflammation. Now, what does your body do during inflammation? It starts releasing cortisol. So those cortisone changes you were talking about earlier could be temporary phasic cortisone changes. Again, we're talking about individuals, so I can't really comment there. But if you are inflamed, you tend to release cortisone. Cortisone tends to break down tissues, so we don't want it at a terribly high level for too long. It's not be there to protect us from sudden traumatic injury. But a better measure in your blood, next time you go for a blood test, is something called C-reactive protein, or high sensitivity C-reactive protein. And this is a very good proxy for your overall chronic inflammation state of your body. You want it to be very low. So that's one way you can kind of measure. We talk about biohacking. That's one good biohacking tool to measure your state of inflammation generally.
That's that's what I've had that checked quite often. Obviously with my injuries and things, I've had a lot of blood tests over the last few years. And that also, prompted me to get further blood tests. And I actually, because I would like to do this experiment, and I would like to do a longer fast. And that's what I also wanted to ask you about as well. If you do any fasting, I would like to do a longer fast, sort of 3 days, 3-4 days, something like that. But I thought it might be beneficial potentially to be ketogenic or, in a ketogenic state for a while beforehand to maybe make that transition a little easier than to just go cold turkey and just stop eating for a few days. I am quite aware of the carbs that I'm eating, and the carbs I eat generally are healthier carbs in terms of, vegetables and potatoes and things like that. I try to avoid anything processed, but I have still been, I still eat carbs. So, what do you think would be a good transitional protocol for me, going into something like that?
Well, there's a lot wrapped up in that question, so I'll try to a little bit there. So one of the reasons I wrote the book Bio Diet with my wife, by the way, is a journalist. So she took my 1,200-page tome and said, nobody's going to read this because it's all just going to go away over. It's like everything I knew about nutrition and metabolism. Yeah. So we made it into a book that's very user-friendly. The first half explains why ketogenic diet works. The second half is how-to. So you're asking the how-to questions, and asking about intermittent fasting. So just if we can start from the beginning, so you asked a lot there. So the first thing I would do is I would get sugar out of your diet. That's the first thing I would say to anybody. You don't need sugar, like sucrose. And one of the main sources of sucrose is fruits that we eat. So most of the fruits we eat are not natural state fruits. They're very, very sweet. And they're sweet because they have lots of sucrose, which is plant sugar. And plant sugar has fructose, and fructose is a known hepatotoxin, and it causes all kinds of problems. So first thing I like to get sugar. If you want to use a sugar substitute, go for it. We can talk about that as a separate issue. But the second thing would be to reduce all that junk food. Any kind of package, anything that comes in a package isn't really worth eating. It's manufactured for somebody who wants to sell food and isn't really interested in your health. Just go around the outsides of the grocery store, and eat that stuff. Next step would be to reduce your carbs. I would say is reduce the root vegetables. So don't eat things that grow below the ground, except for maybe onions and garlic. I eat lots of vegetables, but it's stuff that grows above the ground that isn't a bean or a grain. So you don't want to eat greens. I eat green beans, but broccoli and all kinds of stuff. A lot of tomatoes, a lot of avocados. I eat probably a handful of nuts and a handful of berries every day. So I am getting some carbs, but it's really low. So you want to work towards that, Stefan, and just reduce the carbohydrate burden. And what you'll find as you need to reduce it a significant degree in order to what we call keto adapt. You need to adapt to beta oxidation as your primary source of energy production. And in order to do that, you have to maintain very low carbohydrate for at least a couple of weeks. And when you do that, make sure you eat lots of salty stuff, because a lot of this stuff that we eat that is high in carbs is also high in salt, like bread, for example. And then, and then once you keto adapt, you can test your adaptation through, urine sticks, for keto sticks for urine or whatever. But once you've adapted, they'll go to zero anyway, because you're burning the ketones. Now, that's a good way to start. Now, one of the good things about being keto adapted is you don't get hungry. And I have one fellow I know who's an emergency room physician. He said, one of the best things about your diet, Dave, is that I can go into the emergency room for a 24-hour shift and I don't feel like I have to eat. He said, I used to work for 3 or 4 hours. I'd be starving and I'd have to take a break when I couldn't, and I'd just be starving. So I'm thinking about how hungry I am. Well, somebody's dying on the gurney in front of me. And you just don't get hungry. You do get hungry, but not in the same way. So it would help with the intermittent fasting because you wouldn't have those initial hunger issues. Now, combining the two, by the way, I have no issues with intermittent fasting. Well, I shouldn't say that. I have two issues with intermittent fasting. One is fasting means you're not eating. And as a nutrition scientist, if you're not eating, you're getting zero nutrition. So when you are fasting for 2 or 3 days, yes, you're not eating. So your body's going to change its metabolism to start working as if you're not going to have a source of food. And it's going to start preserving your body, especially the proteins in your body. And so it's hard. Well, it's impossible to get full nutrition if you're also not eating at all. The second thing is when you are eating, when you do eat, are you getting enough of all the nutrients you need during those non-fasting periods? So from what I know, and this is mostly done on animal models that we've been experimenting with intermittent fasting, when you apply that to humans, it seems like narrowing our eating window on a daily basis to 8 hours or less is a good thing. And I speak in particular of reducing your incidence of cancer.
Yeah.
And by the way, if I was diagnosed with cancer, I'd probably look into taking rapamycin. We can talk about that later. I just want to throw that out there. Rapamycin's a kind of, you probably know about it, but I would be looking at that. So when you fast, again, it's okay as long as you're eating a full balanced diet when you're not fasting. A lot of people do something called OMAD, 1 meal a day. That seems pretty good as long as it's a big meal, as long as you're getting all the nutrients you need. And then I would be really reluctant to fast for more than about 2 days in a row. I think, if you fast 1 day a week or a couple of days in a row, it's probably fine. It seems about 2 or 3 days, there's kind of a threshold. And what we've seen is the activation of gene pathways in the cells called thrifty genes. And the thrifty genes are activated from an evolutionary perspective when our body feels like we're in a period of famine. So, normally, the normal human way of eating is feast or famine. You run down a mastodon, everybody eats like crazy, and then you might not get another one for another month or something like that. So your body is designed to slow your metabolism, and it will slow significantly by as much as 40%, especially if you're going out 4 or 5, 6 days. It will slow tremendously, and it's really hard to get those genes turned off once they're turned on. So, those shows like the 600-pound, diet and stuff where they lose a whole bunch of weight. Every single person that's been on those shows put the weight back on within, they've been on the show a year previous. They've all put the weight back on and more. Because what they've done is starve themselves, and you starve yourself, yes, you lose weight, but your body just turns on these thrifty genes and then they don't turn off. And so now you add your regular diet back and you just put on weight, which is why we get those yo-yo diets, right? Calorie restricted diets don't work because the whole calorie model is broken. But if you're not getting enough energy in your system, your body will act to conserve energy because it's acting to preserve itself. So I think fasting is good. Now, if you look at what happens at the cellular level during fasting, so they talk about autophagy, for example, being promoted. It's a good sort of house cleaning maybe thing, a water fast once a day. Make sure you get enough salts. Make sure you stay well hydrated. The other actions that happen are all things that happen with a ketogenic diet anyway. So what I haven't seen yet is a study that shows here's a group that are fasting and ketogenic, here's a group that are just ketogenic, and here are the differences. Because the things that a fast activate are similar things to what a ketogenic diet activates. But then the ketogenic diet goes way beyond that because the ketones that are produced are kind of super molecules that have all kinds of other beneficial effects throughout the body, in particular at the cellular level. So one of the things that fasting doesn't do that a ketogenic diet does, so one of the things that happens during fasting is you start going into ketosis. So you're producing ketones anyway, right?
Yeah.
So, and those ketones they deactivate a cellular modulator called the NLRP3 inflammasome. Okay, so this is a cellular modulator that actually is the root cause of inflammation, and that's one of the ways that ketogenic diets can reduce inflammation. Is they kind of turn that off. So there's another benefit there. If we want to talk about cancer, one of the things that the ketones do is they deregulate the mTOR pathway. So mTOR is the mammalian target of rapamycin. And so that is a pathway that is really highly growth directed. So it's about 200 different enzymatic pathways that promote growth. And of course, if you have cancer cells, those are cells that are growing uncontrollably. So if you can deregulate mTOR, that's beneficial.
With mTOR, I've also heard that when you're eating a lot of meat, that has an impact on mTOR, and also strength training has an impact on mTOR. And how big is the effect with those in comparison to something, because obviously mTOR is not necessarily good or bad. It's just you can't have it switched on all the time.
Well, no. I mean, mTOR, all those 200 pathways are necessary pathways. If any one of them was shut off, you'd die, right? So, but they need to be regulated. So when I say dysregulated, it's not turning it off. I should say downregulated is probably a better term than dysregulated, because it implies that there's a dysfunction there. It's downregulated. And so to answer that question, the exercise study, you could probably look at that and demonstrate something. The eating meat study, you can demonstrate almost nothing in nutritional studies, because people have to eat anyway. And what you'd have to do is get one group that just does this, get another group that just does that. You'd have to feed them. You'd have to feed them for a long enough time to see that difference. And there'd have to be enough in the sample size on either side to demonstrate that. And so when I say, I think a ketogenic diet will greatly reduce your risk of chronic disease, there's not enough money on the planet for me to do that experiment, because you'd need to take tens of thousands of people and feed them only what you want them to eat for decades and see what the incidence of these chronic diseases as they appear. And our study, which had less than 20 people on the experimental side, that was just a 12-week study, actually 3 months, 12-week study with about 20 people. That was $1 million. To do that kind of, it was an amazing study. We had amazing clinical tools we were using, but so you're never going to do that experiment. So whether or not, what we can do is look at people that have a disease. We can put them on a ketogenic diet. We can see if things change. So we do see improvements in cardiovascular markers. We see great improvements in type 2 diabetes. What we're trying to demonstrate is it a good adjunct therapy for cancer treatments? And that's all very preliminary. And I should preface all this by reminding people I'm not a physician, and also emphasizing the fact that a ketogenic diet is not a cure for cancer. I'm not saying that anybody that does is lying to you, because we don't know that. It's a good adjunct therapy in the studies we've completed so far. There have been no adverse effects. We've seen the same positive metabolic changes we have in the general public. And we've seen some improvements in the hypermetastases of breast cancer in our study. And they've studied glioblastoma multiforme. We've studied some pancreatic cancer. There's a few cancers. They're very expensive and hard to do, these cancer studies. So far, the indications are that it's a good adjunct therapy to standard of care. So all the way back to the idea of intermittent fasting, I do it every day because I go to bed at night and I don't eat during the night. I get up in the morning and I eat. So I'm fasting. I do try not to eat after about 8 o'clock at night. Nothing but water. There's other reasons we can talk about maybe on another show why you shouldn't eat stuff just before you go to bed, especially carbohydrates. And you can experiment with whatever works for you. Some people kind of like that OMAD one meal a day, and they just have a big, fulsome meal that has all the nutrients they need. I'm a bit more of a grazer, but I don't eat lunch because I like eating breakfast. So I eat when I get up in the morning. And then we have a meal that would look like your meal at night, but there's just no, pasta, rice, potatoes, or anything like that on the plate. And I don't eat a lot during the day, but if I eat, strangely, I'll snack on things like chicharron, which are like, fried pork skin, fried in lard. I'll eat chicken hearts. or chicken livers. Like I'm a nose to tail kind of guy. I think that's
Yep.
important. But I'm not. I wouldn't call myself carnivore, but I could be, and I don't think there's any harm in it. But I've never done the. I'm like you. I want to try some things, so I try the intermittent fast. But the thing is, I'm I only weigh 146 pounds. I don't need to lose weight.
Yeah.
And I do my body work all the time. Like I'm very good about my regular medical checkups, and I get all this stuff done. I just had a colonoscopy. Everything is working perfectly. So it's kind of like, why would I change anything? But 15 years ago now, almost 16 years ago, when I started the ketogenic diet, I was still in good health, but I was 30 pounds heavier, and it was mostly around my belly, and I drank too much beer and I ate too many cookies, and I was starting to ache all the time, and I was getting brain fog, and I thought, well, I better do something. So that's when those lights turned on during that radio show, and here we are ever since. I've just been, so I'm a good N=1 study to show that a ketogenic diet isn't going to kill you, because I've been doing it a long time. But during the day, at lunch, I have this. I was drinking tea, but when I drink tea or coffee, I drink it with full-fat cream, like whipping cream. And just a warning, if you ever do that, you'll never go back, because nothing else will be as satisfying. So.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I tried, this whole thing, fasting and diets and stuff, was not for losing weight specifically, because I didn't have necessarily a weight problem. Although when I was a kid, I did. But since I've obviously been doing a lot of sport and training over the last years, that all changed. But it was more from a performance and just feeling good, in everyday life, and also dealing with a lot of inflammation due to the injuries that I'd had, and obviously over the years, doing a sport like I've done takes its toll, and you have aches and pains and stuff, and that's why I've been really interested in doing some more longer fasts and stuff, because I'd also heard about stem cell production increasing and things like that, which and obviously ketones bringing down inflammation, so a lot of benefits there. And so I've been doing, I wouldn't say I don't do anything. I'm not like a 16-8 sort of person, but occasionally. So some days I fast till lunchtime. Other days I eat breakfast. I sort of change it up, and I do every now and again. I'll do a 24-hour fast. Some dinner to dinner. But I haven't done more than a day yet. But what was interesting is when I first tried to skip breakfast, it was so hard. It was a few years ago now. And I remember I was so hungry, and I had, I sort of didn't quite get the shakes, but I felt, lightheaded. My mood was down, couldn't concentrate, and it was wild. And now I can easily not eat the whole day, and I could still go for a run in the afternoon, and I still feel pretty okay. I don't feel like I'm lacking. I wouldn't do anything like doing sprints or something, but anything sort of zone 2, I could do quite easily. And when I go out with friends, they think it's absolutely mad. If we go for a ride, a couple of hour cycle in the morning, and they're like eating energy bars, and they had breakfast, and then they're having like 3 bars on the ride, and then they find out when I tell them that I haven't eaten anything, they can't believe it, and they're really concerned. They're like, but you have to eat. You need sugar. And I think it's just crazy how brainwashed the society is.
Well, they have to do that because they're carbohydrate adapted, not fat adapted. So some of the ultra endurance athletes we work with, they do those 100-mile runs in the desert over mountains, and they don't eat anything. They just do the run. And one guy did it. He won the race, and then he went and did another one the next day. Okay, again, not don't try that at home, but no, if you're fat adapted, because you can only store about 2,000 calories as carbohydrate, it's glycogen in your muscles and liver, and that's, if you're not eating, that's what you've got to work on. And if you run out of that, what happens is your blood sugar drops, and then you get hungry, and the more your blood sugar drops, the hungrier you get. So then you're eating those candy bars to satisfy that. But what that does is raise the insulin levels. And insulin will take out that sugar and more, and then they're hungry again, so they have to eat another bar. And that's that cycle that most people are in. They have a high-carb breakfast, and then a high-carb lunch, and then a high-carb dinner, and they're just always pushing themselves above the limits. So when you're fat-adapted, you don't get that hunger. because you're now using beta oxidation to burn fats instead of sugars, and it's overall improvement. So that's a very good anecdotal story from your friends there too. But the other thing, and Tim Noakes will talk about this too, because he was an endurance athlete, and he realized he developed type 2 diabetes and realized that this was due to carb loading, like which we do in the 70s. I don't know if do you guys still do that?
Yeah.
You still do carb loading?
Well, I don't.
Yeah,
But,
I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't depend on carbs for my energy source because you run out of gas on an endurance event. But so a lot of those ultra endurance athletes that used to carb load, they're now the rate at which they're becoming type 2 diabetic is like 3 times the rate of the general public, because they really burned out their islet cells in their pancreas producing insulin. They just can't produce enough anymore. They're becoming insulin resistant, and that one's hard to turn back on again. I wanted to talk about the cancer too, if I can just relate the kind of basic principle, that because I talked about some of the results of our study, but and this is the analogy I like to use, Stefan. If you think of, you look out in your back garden and you see all the, the grass and the flowers and the things you want to have there. But if you went off, touring for 6 months on the world tour or something, you came back, you would be overgrown with weeds, right? And so think of that garden the way you want it, as your nice healthy cells, and think of those weeds as cancer cells. And so, like we discussed earlier, those cancer cells are developing every day, all the time. And fortunately, we have a built-in weed whacker system, right, which is our immune system, which will go through, find the weeds when they're small and destroy them before they can grow and outcompete the healthy plants you want to have there. So when you're on a high, so if you talk about plants need 2 things to live. They need sunlight, which is what they produce sugar from, right? And then they need growth factors, which are hormones, gibberellins they call them, that promote growth. And so on a high carb diet, what you're doing is you're raising the level of sugar, and cancer cells. It's a theory developed by Otto Warburg. It's a Warburg theory that they're he called it fermentation, but they're dependent on anaerobic respiration. So fermentation. So they can't actually, the cancer cells don't have, I'm really generalizing, but the majority of cancer cells that produce solid tumors, the mitochondria can't actually undergo oxidative respiration. So they're dependent on this less efficient waste-producing anaerobic respiration. And so they're really dependent on glucose, because that's the major fuel for that. Because fats don't go through the same pathway. They go through the beta oxidation pathway. So they're super dependent on glucose. So that's how we image cancer cells, is we apply a radioactive tag onto the glucose. We call it fluorodeoxyglucose. We inject that, and the cancer cells will super concentrate that like 200 times, because that's the fuel they're using. So we know that cancer cells love glucose. And so if you're on a high carb diet, you're providing all the glucose it could possibly need. And we already talked about earlier, when you increase glucose levels in your body, then the insulin levels, I'll try and get on camera here, the insulin levels go up to take that glucose back out. Insulin is one of the most powerful growth factors in your body. So that's like the gibberellin, that's the growth factor. So you're giving, go back to the plants, you're giving them all the sunlight and all the fertilizer they could possibly want specifically for the weeds. And so the weeds are going to grow like crazy, and that balance between the cancer cells developing and your immune system's ability to destroy it gets disrupted in favor of the cancer cells. Now, if you take a ketogenic diet approach and you reduce the amount of glucose in the blood to its natural level, it doesn't go to zero because you still need glucose, but you reduce it to its natural level, and then you reduce the insulin levels will reduce, concomitantly to a low level. What you're doing is you're kind of dimming the sunlight, and you're reducing the fertilizer available for these cancer cells to grow. And at the same time, some of the studies we've done at the BC Cancer Research Center show that we have upregulated the immune response, the specific immune response to cancer cells. So it's a more powerful weed whacker, if you like. So now we're tipping the balance in favor of your body's immune system identifying, destroying those cancer cells before they grow. So that's how we think ketogenic diets will help to prevent cancers in the first place, because we get them all the time. It just makes your immune system more effective at identifying them and prevents them from growing too quickly. And perhaps it explains as well why high carb diets are promoting this increased incidence of cancer that we're seeing in the Western world, which we put on a high carb diet 40 years ago. So we're now seeing the results of that mistake we made.
And is glucose the only fuel source for cancer, or does it use other fuel sources as well?
Okay, so cancer, there's hundreds of different types of cancer, and there's, solid tumors is what we've been working on. Even there's different genetic phenotypes and so on. So the types of cancer cells that are wholly dependent on anaerobic respiration, the Warburg effect would be between 60 and 90% of those solid tumors. So not all of them. Some types of tumors can use other sources of fuel to a lesser degree. They're all somewhat dependent on fermentation, but and then there are others which can happily, metabolize ketones and so on. So again, the ketogenic diet is not a blanket cure for cancer, but what it's doing is at least putting your body back into the optimal state of detecting cancers when they're early. Part of what you're saying goes into the treatment effect. So there are some cancers we wouldn't want to treat with a ketogenic diet because we wouldn't want those ketone levels to be high. And they're quite rare, but that's why you should always talk to your physician and your oncologist about this stuff, because I'm neither of those things. So I just do the bench science. I don't even really do that. I have graduate students that do that, and I just kind of talk to people like you about it. So having the opportunity to do that is great, because then, hopefully lots of people listen. And, and thanks again for doing the show. It's great. But hopefully it's a common sense kind of approach. And I think the problem is that people have these notions in our heads that we were talking about earlier, saturated fats cause heart disease, eating red meat causes colon cancer. What you have to do is be curious and ask yourself, well, how do they know that? And if you go and look for the actual evidence, you'll see that it's either so flimsy or it's not there. And what it is somebody in the past just grabbed onto that, thought it was a good idea, and ran with it. And that's, in science, whatever, we'll find them out, we'll expose them, we'll get rid of them. But what they did was they penetrated public policy making, and politicians and journalists and so on, they're not usually highly trained in science. So they don't have the time or the understanding to understand a conversation we're having like this. I wish they did. That's why I'm trying to explain it in simple terms as I know, so that the average person out there can go, that makes total sense. And, so some of the things they can take home are the notion of high glucose diets are not good for cancer. There's a report out from the American Diabetes Association today recommending a diet. First thing they recommended was lower carbohydrates. It took us like 10 years to get them to do that, because they were arguing, no, high carb, low fat is what you want because people lose weight. And it took us 10 years to get them to understand that was making people worse, not better, because they have a glucose intolerance and you're asking them to eat more glucose. How does that make sense? I don't know, they'll lose weight and it'll make them better. You got to stop thinking that way and open your eyes and listen to the science. And hopefully I've helped to make it simpler so that people can understand it. It can get really, really interesting and complicated. But the more I learn and the more I dig down into it, the more I realize that this is absolutely the right track to be on in nutrition science. And if we go back to the biological perspective, this is the diet on which we evolved. So we evolved on keto. There were no cornflakes and pizzas, there or up in the north, where Inuit live and eat diets that are 60 to 90% saturated fats and have on their traditional diet, have no cancer, no diabetes, no heart disease. They live long lives. You put them on our diet and they get diabetes, they get obese, they get cancer, and they die like 7 years earlier. So, go back to our natural state, turn your body back into its natural state, understand what that state is, and fuel yourself accordingly. And by the way, it is considered a restrictive diet because I don't eat much, high glycemic index carbohydrate, but it's a very satisfying diet that I eat because it's high fat, which is where all the flavor and all the textures are and so on. And I eat I'm an omnivore, a varied diet. But pretty much everything I eat is, unless you consider wine, which I drink a little of, or cheese. Those are processed, I guess, but nothing I eat is processed. It's all just natural food that is, grown by hopefully respectful farmers. I try and buy organic and buy animal-friendly food products and so on, and make sure that the chickens are from free range. And I do my part as an individual, but it does worry me, the sort of counter movement about, no, we should all just be eating plants and that'll make the world a better place. And I just totally disagree with that. I think that's just politics, and it's got nothing to do with health. I can tell you that.
For the average people that are listening to this, that perhaps just stumbled across this video and don't watch endless health videos and are not really into this, if you could put the most simple change, one thing that you would recommend that they could change today to have the biggest impact on their health, what would that be?
Stop eating sugar. Well, I'll give you a few. One would be stop eating sugar. Like, get sucrose out of your diet, including even plant sources of sucrose, like really sweet fruits and so on. So that'd be one. Two would be don't eat processed food, especially ultra processed food, which is the stuff that comes in packages, because it's almost certainly not good for you. And I would avoid inflammatory seed oils, maybe as a third one. But I think if you do the first two, just stop eating sugar and stop eating crappy ultra processed food, you're already halfway there to a healthier life, right? And so that's kind of, we started off, I said, I'm in this game to have people live happier, healthier lives. And I think health is the most important thing. If you're not healthy, as you've learned, if you're not healthy, everything else gets compromised. Everything else takes second place to your health. So let's get in good health and stay in good health. And if we do have a circumstance where we're not in good health, let's take the right steps to put ourselves back on the right track and not depend on the healthcare system to keep fixing things that are going to keep breaking. You really have to rethink it from square one. What am I as a human being? How did I evolve? And the most important lifestyle decision you make every day is on the end of your fork. So if you keep that front of mind, then I think we're on our way.
It's interesting that you said that, because I think a lot of people, whether they're an athlete or in business, or people get so wrapped up in their own worlds and just forget about the simple things, and just take everything for granted. And I learned, when, in a way, as much as my injuries and things were horrible at the time, I'm actually in some ways very grateful that it happened, because it taught me a lot more about myself and what's important. And without your health, really, that needs to come first for everyone. It needs to come before even your loved ones, because if you're not healthy, you can't help anyone else or share anything with anyone else either. So, which doesn't help. So, and I think people, if I look at what people buy in the grocery stores, when I'm standing there and it's just like frozen pizzas and sweets and package this and package that, and I just think people have no idea. And I hope that we can make some sort of an impact over the coming years. I think there's been a big movement, but through people like yourself and because it's scary, people just living in.
Sorry, you said the right word there, because I think what you've experienced, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase Nietzsche not very well, but we feel most alive when we've truly faced death. And it's only when suddenly something breaks that you actually rethink it all. And I just wish people would not wait till it breaks, that they would make those changes beforehand. And it does take a little bit of planning. It takes a little bit of determination. Takes a little bit of grit. You got to stick with it. And I wish, I think you're seeing the silver lining of the experiences you've had, which is you've now found a pathway to a healthier life, which is great. And hopefully people will realize that before things go wrong. But unfortunately, it's just not human nature, because it's our ability to see risk, right? We don't see the risk in something if whatever that risk is realized down the road somewhere. It's only the hand on the hot element. We can do that pretty well. But if the risk is like 5 minutes away from what we're doing now, we're just going to do whatever we want. And, hope for the best. So we're just not wired very well for that. So we just, I'm an educator. You got to educate people and let them know. And every single person that comes to me after something's broken. They go, I had your book, I read your book, I kind of ignored it. Now I'm thinking maybe you're right. I go, yeah, well, we're 5 years now later than we should have been. But sure, I'm here to help you. So it's almost like saving for retirement. It's one of those things. You can have your fun now, or you can have it later. So I plan on living a long, healthy, happy life. And so far, so good.
Dr. Harper, I have a question that I ask everyone at the end of the podcast. I ask every guest and get their take on it, and that is, what is the meaning of success to you? Everyone's got a different outlook on this. It could be, their own agenda, but I'm interested to hear, what would you consider for yourself? What would make you successful?
No, that's a great question. And what came to mind was leading a life with purpose. I think if you can identify a purpose and align that with your own experience and talents, we all have God-given talents, or whatever hyper-intelligent pan-dimensional being you decide to worship. But we all have talents, and I think leading a life with purpose seems to be really important. At least in my health courses, I emphasize that. So that, again, coming back, my purpose is to try and help people have happier, healthier lives. And I'm an educator and a scientist, so I try and bring those to the table. And then I couldn't do it, without people like you, Stefan, that give me the opportunity to talk to folks. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, and thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been really a pleasure to chat to you, and find out about all the things that have been on my mind. I mean, honestly, I could talk to you for the whole day probably, and not get bored. Thanks so much, and I'm looking forward to potentially doing it again in the future.
Absolutely, I'd be delighted.
That was iconic.